Madeline, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you for your flexibility. I know this is our second attempt at this, but I'm really excited to have you here and have this conversation, but also understanding the work you're doing, because I think it's really noble and it's really important. And I'll obviously talk about why I think it's important, especially when it comes to gut health. And then the focus being unique here with respect to children. And I saw a paper recently, an old colleague of mine published around if we're able to help children stay healthy early in life, it does affect them in a positive way into their adult life. So often we overlook that factor and say, oh, they're children, they'll figure it out. They're young, they're resilient. While that may be true, but I think it's important as adults to then play a healthy influence in their lives as well, because it can have other consequences later on. So I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit there as well. But before we go into all of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what's brought you here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and really glad to be here and excited to talk about health and specifically kids' health. And it's one of those things that I think now the national conversation has moved more towards, but for too long, kids have been unwell and they're getting more and more sick. It's not okay that half of American kids are on track to having a chronic illness by 2035. And that's a problem, right? It's a national security concern. It's a concern for just like the general well-being of our nation. And we really need to resolve this. And so it's been very refreshing to have those conversations finally take center stage here with the national conversation. But with that, I'll just get started. Madeline Lauf here, founder at Begin Health, where kids gut microbiome health company focused on the earliest of ages and building strong, resilient gut microbiomes for kids for lifelong health. And as you exactly mentioned, we're learning more and more about the gut microbiome. It seems like it's people are talking about it, understanding its role in overall lifelong health. But what we're starting to really find out is that at the earliest of ages is our greatest opportunity for impact. And for me, that was really why it was obvious to get started with kids, because as adults, we can make choices. We can understand right from wrong. But kids do not have that agency. Kids have to do what is happening around them, right? And so at Begin, our goal is to educate parents with the tools, knowledge, and nutritional products that help their kids be healthy.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for sharing all of that. And I guess just to understand a little bit further, what motivated you to focus on this? And why are you so passionate about this field in helping children and their health, focusing on their health?
Yeah, so I'll take you back. A quick story. So I grew up in rural Illinois, pretty small town, and the only goal out of rural Illinois is to get the hell out. And so that brought me to studying economics at the University of Chicago. And what really motivated me to really understand economics was just that everything around us is ruled by incentives.
Mm-hmm.
I was so motivated by big challenges and hard problems, and that took me over to Asia. So I was living in Asia and back in like the 2010s, briefly. And there was this enormous amount of importing of the infant formulas in Asia. And I was like, wait, what's going on here? It turned out that the Asian population wanted to import the American infant formulas at astronomical levels because they had gone through a massive crisis in '08 that a lot of babies, unfortunately, were impacted by some of the loose regulations, let's say, in China. So anyways, this was like so mind-boggling. And here I am. I'm from rural Illinois. I was like, you know what? Like I grew up near the dairy farms. Let's build a better baby formula. So I ended up coming back and I was on this journey to build a healthier baby formula, because at the end of the day, if we want to solve healthcare in America, we should start at the beginning with our first food. Our first food, unfortunately, many times more than not, is infant formula because the babies aren't breastfeeding as long as what's recommended. So I was building a bit better baby formula, and that was really what I started off with Begin Health. Unfortunately, there were so many regulatory challenges, a lot of money constraints that you really had to fundamentally rethink that supply chain. And the sad part is that even with innovation, the way that the regulatory environment is, it's very hard to innovate in infant formula. So I was like, we still need to solve this problem, right? How can we come to this problem from a different angle? And that was really when just doing market research, understanding what was going on and diving deeper. When I started Begin Health, as I mentioned, we ended up having to pivot a couple times because we wanted to tackle the big problem. It didn't matter how we got there. So if it wasn't infant formula, then it was like, okay, now what? I was like, all right, let's approach this. Let's build a better baby milk, a kid's milk. Let's one and up. That way you can get rid of the regulatory hurdles that were holding us back. We built the kids' milk. That was impossible to fundraise for. At the time, dairy was completely out of vogue. It was like, unless this is plant-based, there was all these innovations happening there. Nobody wanted to fund it. Then it was like, how do you know parents want this? So we ended up actually pivoting for a third time. But what was so interesting about that was we were only able to find the third product based on the market learnings from the kids' milk. And let me tell you what those were. We launched this kids' milk and we're like, let's rethink this category, right? These kids are not getting the nutrients they need. The nutrition that is available to them is full of seed oils and additives and preservatives and all this stuff. So we built the cutest little kids' milk. It had exactly the nutrients that the kids were missing. And we piloted it. And what we found was that we were getting the most amount of traction from some of these families whose kids were having digestive issues. And the reason was that they're picky eaters. And after learning a little bit more about them, we found out that actually the kids were having trouble with constipation. And so we were like, wait a minute, let's investigate this. One of the innovations in our milk happened to have been what I think is one of the cooler innovations in infant formulas over the last 10 years, which is the prebiotic found in human breast milk we included in our kids' milk. And that prebiotic helped with softer stooling. So it was almost by accident that we found this approach that was like, you know what, we need to solve kids' constipation, which happens to be about 3 in 10 kids will experience constipation. And that's a massive issue. What is the only solution that the parents have today is laxatives. They go to the pediatrician. The number one recommendation is a laxative, which, by the way, is not approved by the FDA for anyone under the age of 17. It's not approved for you and I for over 7 days of use. And some of these kids are on it for years, right? And that is just not acceptable. This is a long story, but it was really sharing that sometimes when you're trying to solve a big problem, you can't just solve the thing that you wanted to solve right away. You have to approach it from a different perspective. But at the end of the day, the problem was kids' health, and it didn't matter how we got there. And so this happened to be our approach.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you walking us through all of that. And I agree. There is a lesson in there in terms of starting any business, right? You have a problem that you want to solve, but how you get there, to your point, can change along the way. And I do want to come back to that. But before we talk about the pivot and some of the challenges you had to go through to finally get to the underlying problem, if we were to call it that. Now, if we were to identify this problem, because you touched on the infant formulas, and I've had experience with this, like where the hospital's like, well, the child's not getting enough nutrition, let's put them on the formula immediately. And to your point, that can be problematic because there is this prebiotic in breast milk that can really help children with digestion and kind of having that healthy gut. So without getting into all the details, I'm assuming there's also an incentive here for whether it's the pharmaceutical companies or the health system to push these formulas, right? And we're not fully aware of some of the negative consequences that can come from these formulas. But unfortunately, the society we live in, it's hard. Like, kids are being taken off breast milk a lot sooner than they used to be. I think you're supposed to at least give it 2 or 3 years, but then they're being put on formulas. So systemically, what are some of those issues that you were identifying and you see that are still persisting with when it comes to raising toddlers and making sure they're getting the right nutrition?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it can be a little controversial. Infant formula absolutely can be life saving, right? If a baby is not able to get the nutrition that they need, whether the mother is not producing breast milk, I'm not going to shame anybody that has to use infant formula. There is a role for it, and a really important one. I think the bigger challenges here are, like you're saying, they're more systemic, and they're essentially like, how can we make better policy decisions also that can incentivize some of these things? But we know for sure that breast milk is the gold standard. Kids should be on breast milk as long as possible. A lot of the nutrition scientists that we speak with, honestly, like historically, kids did breastfeed up until age 3, age 4. You go to developing countries, and to this day, 3 and 4 year olds are breastfeeding, right? Because it's really just helping the development of the gut microbiome. The nutrition is built for humans. It's perfect. That's really special. And right now, I think if you go back to the 80s, there was a time when infant formula was almost marketed as better than breast milk. And that's a problem, right? Because we know better than that now. And yes, some of the companies that we're back to ruled by incentives, right? You want to make money. So of course, you're going to try to find a way to market infant formula to be superior to breast milk, but we know that's not the case. So how can we encourage more women to breastfeed? How can we encourage them to breastfeed longer? And when it does come to if and when you do need to supplement, how do we encourage more companies to include more of the positive ingredients that do make the bridge between breast milk and infant formula? And for one, that's the human milk oligosaccharide. That's the prebiotic in human breast milk. Human breast milk has about 100 human milk oligosaccharides. These are very special prebiotics. They all serve different purposes. This is a really cool innovation, like I said, that happened over the last 10-ish years that we know from stooling samples of breastfed infants and infant formula babies, that if the infant formula babies have the human milk oligosaccharides that can now be made through fermentation and included in the formulas, their stools will be closer to that of those that are breastfed. And that's really cool. The challenge is, to make HMOs, it's really expensive. This is where the companies can really do right by the consumer, is finding ways to make that more affordable, but including more of the HMOs in the infant formulas. And this is where sometimes I get a little bit upset, is that from a marketing perspective, infant formula companies will say made with HMOs, but the amount of HMO is so small. They're just doing it to make a label claim. And that's really where my heart breaks, because families want to do what's best for their kiddo. They want to give their kiddos these HMOs, but it's really not significant. And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to create a product for babies that can help supplement them, so that they can get the right amount of HMOs.
Yeah. No, and again, thank you for that. And you talked about the nutritional value of the breast milk, but there's another element there that often goes missed, is the emotional attachment, right? And you see a lot of issues around that too. And in the space of psychology, we talk about attachment type of relationships. And I think the more moms are involved or the caretakers are involved, that allows for healthier relationships for the children as they grow up. So that's another element that perhaps may get missed at times when we're talking about breastfeeding. But then to your point, there's the nutritional piece, the gut microbiome. I do want to come back to the pivot
Oh, well, I
piece.
want to add one more thing to that. And this is, the human body is so insane. But what's really even like mind boggling is the feedback loop that exists between breastfeeding and the nutritional component of the breast milk. And what we're learning is that the baby's own saliva can give a feedback loop to the mother through the breast to understand what the baby needs more of. And that is, to me, just the beauty of the human body. And we lose that when we do have more of the pumping, breast milk freezing. You're just not getting that human evolutionary breast milk that was built for babies. So I think that's also missed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for adding that. Now, I do want to come back to the business side because you did talk about having to pivot and trying to really explore. And obviously, as you were getting more involved in and going deeper into that exploration, you were learning more. But what I'm always curious when it comes to entrepreneurs, like what allowed you to stick with it and not feel discouraged at times when you weren't seeing the results based on the original hypothesis you had? How was that process for you? And
Oh, my word. Oh, geez. Like, where do we start with this? Okay. So, my number one rule in entrepreneurship is you can never, ever give up. The only difference between getting to the goal is not stopping. And I learned this lesson painfully from my first company, Revolt Electric Bikes. I started an electric bike company about 10 years ago. And it was one of those things where it was insurmountable. It was hard. I didn't have the money. I didn't have the network. I didn't have the skills really to launch this company successfully. And so ultimately I gave up. Right. And the only difference that the reason I don't have a Revolt today was because I stopped. And so for me, I had learned that lesson early on. I was 23 years old. And I knew that in deep within me, I was like, if I was ever going to do a company again, there's only one rule. It's do not stop. And yes, launching Begin was really hard. It was about a year and a half, 2 years. I'm saying I tell people, I was like, we're pulling a company through the mud, right? I was fundraising for infant formula company. I needed 6 million. I needed 10 million. I actually probably needed like 100 million to get started. And here I am going to venture capitalists and they're like, who the hell are you? What's your background? I was like, I have this amazing team of scientists from me, Johnson and Abbott Labs, and they're super skilled. But I was like, but who are you? And so I couldn't convince them for crap. And so I was like, all right, no one's handing me $100 million to start my infant formula manufacturing plant. So how do we go about this? And it's really just, you have to believe relentlessly in the problem. You have to love the problem. If you do not love the problem that you are working on in entrepreneurship, forget it. It's too hard. You have to love the problem, fall in love with it. It doesn't matter how you get there. And so at Begin, it was like, you know what? Let's just keep going at it. And ultimately, I think that's the beauty of entrepreneurship is that we never would have gotten to the idea that ultimately was successful if we had never started and then learned and then pivoted. And I think that's really important. I always tell entrepreneurs, just start. Just find the thing and start working towards it, and it's going to unlock something else.
yeah, and again, I agree with you, and I appreciate what you're sharing there in terms of your own journey. But when do you? It's a fine balance too, right? Because you can become very stubborn and keep going down this rabbit hole. How do you find the right balance in terms of knowing that maybe you've hit a dead end and it's time to pivot, and versus that whole persistence and the consistency that you're referring to is you're continue to solve the problem, but sometimes you have to cut your losses and realize that, okay, this isn't the answer. Maybe I need to look somewhere else and then go down that path. So how do you find that balance? And do you have people around you who you can bounce ideas off of, or who are also helping you identify your blind spots? Because it can be a lonely place at times when you're finding that, okay, I've gone down this path and it doesn't seem to be working. So when is it time to maybe reevaluate or pivot?
Yeah, no, great question. And it's a lot harder. I've worked both in software and hardware is so much harder to do that because the investment in the time, it just takes longer for that feedback loop, right? For our original idea, like it took 9 months for me to finally of fundraising, I didn't have a product without money and I had no money. So how do you start? Great. It took me 9 months. I probably should have figured it out after 3, right? But after 9, I was like, all right, like I think it was like 300 VC conversations later, it was like, all right, that is just, you do start feeling that pain point of like, all right, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to keep going? And so that was a realization where it's like, okay, this is not working. We need to try something else. When you try this something else, that feedback loop again could be a year. It's really up to your own pain tolerance. Like, how much pain are you willing to endure? But you also have to be very honest with yourself. Are you getting to the mile markers that you need to be able to prove this thing? And I think that's really important. And then once you're able to prove it, again, are you honest with yourself? Is this going, and we're constantly doing that at Begin Health, right? We are working on new products. We're trying to develop market research to understand things, take some R&D, build new products, go test to the market even before we bring it to market. And it's all right, how is this going to go? And sometimes you do just have to launch the thing. But I think overall, a lot of times, actually, I think people actually stop too soon and they were just on the cusp of an unlock if they just listened more or took that extra month, extra time. But that's typically my approach.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're touching on, and there's also an element of what scientists talk about too, is often it is in the failure or coming across a solution that they weren't even exploring, right? So I think that's just, to your point, sticking with it, because while you may think you may not be making any progress or you might be failing, that's where you may end up finding the solution too, and solving the problem in a different way. So I appreciate everything you're sharing there. Now, coming back to the product itself, because you talked about the whole notion of not, like, sometimes the labels can be misleading, and for people that aren't aware and they're consumers, how are you setting yourself apart from the competition in terms of educating parents and helping them understand that there's certain products they should be mindful of when they're giving it to their children? So how do you play into that education piece as well, so then the parents know that, okay, this is a product that is probably better for my child than some of the other ones that are being marketed out there?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I always tell everybody Begin Health is essentially an education company. We are here to help parents on their kids' health journey. We want to help them first and foremost. How can you help your kid with their nutrition? Because we support and advocate for food first diets, right? Eat the nutrition from the vegetables, from the meat, from the actual nutrients that you get from our food. The body is amazing. It wants to heal, it wants to thrive and be energetic, but we need to put the right inputs. So that is our priority at Begin Health. When we start thinking about, a lot of times that is a challenge, right? The nutritional integrity essentially of our food is no longer what it used to be, which is devastating. And that's a huge issue, and we need to solve that too. And so that's really where we come in to build nutritional interventions that do support parents in a clean, healthy, no compromise way. And our first product was Growing Up Prebiotics. It only has 2 ingredients. In fact, we tell you what is in it, exactly how much is in it. And a lot of companies try to be like proprietary formula or try to be around the bush about what's in it. We tell you exactly what's in it and how much. We have built a product that helps kiddos have 3 grams of fiber in a tasteless and textureless way. For kiddos that are picky eaters, they are super tasters, they reject all their fruits and vegetables, and it gets the parent a tool to help their kiddo still get the fiber that we know that they need, that they are not getting enough of. It helps with softer stooling, improve regularity. But anyways, that's a little bit more about the product. But back to this label thing, is that a lot of times, and this breaks my heart, is that marketing is powerful, right? Organic, non-GMO, all these big claims. But then you start reading the ingredients, or if you ask them, wait, let's look under the hood a little bit, and you start finding out, wait, it has an emulsifier, this has a preservative, this has a stabilizer. Wait a minute. And then are these actually gut microbiome positive? No, actually, they're not. And that is what breaks my heart in this business, is that you can try to get these big claims, but unless you're really taking the time to analyze every little thing, it's very easy to be misled. And so that to me is a problem, right? But consumers do need to be more educated and more advocate more for themselves, but it's also incumbent on the companies to do better by the consumer.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, it is sometimes tough if you don't know what the problem is to then know how to educate yourself. So, how do you then advocate for yourself if you don't even know what you're consuming is problematic, right? And a lot of the times, to your point, you just normalize whatever health issues you're experiencing, and you're not able to necessarily pinpoint to diet all the time, right? So that is something we can definitely come back to. But I am curious to understand, because what I'm hearing from you is transparency is very important for you, and obviously education. But then from a business standpoint, are you worried about some of the challenges that come up with intellectual property? Like if people are able to then compete or replicate what the formulas you're putting out there, doesn't that hurt your ability to set yourself apart from the competition? Like, is that a fear, or you're not necessarily worried
No,
about that? Because
it's not a fear. If someone, I always say in business, if someone can do this better than me, please do. Please. We are here to try to innovate, try to be at the forefront, do right by the consumer. And if we continue to stay ahead of the curve, if we continue to build great products with great trust is so important, with kids and families. And that is really, to me, the importance of our business. It's not necessarily the products that we build. The products that we build, yes, you know what? In fact, you can get fiber from other sources. In fact, I'm telling you, please do, right? Go get your fiber from your vegetables. That's who I don't even want to compete with food. We're competing against when you can't get your nutrition from food with other companies that happen to be doing it more in a low cost way. They might be adding a bunch of things because they have to. Actually, it turns out it's actually really hard to create products that don't have bad stuff in them. I get pitched on them every single day. Hey, do this, do that. I was like, that's not something that we're at that one little line item ingredient in your ingredient. We actually have a no tolerance policy for. It was like, great, then we can't use it. So it's actually really hard to do. And that's where really what's important to me for our business is that's where we develop the proprietary nature is just what are our values and making sure that we are sticking by them so that we build long-term trust in our brand.
yeah, and I think to your point, if you're building those relationships with your customers, then they're going to keep coming back because they trust the product and they trust the brand, right? So I can definitely see that. Now, we've touched on the prebiotic side, but what are some other environmental factors that parents need to be aware of, and making sure there's also probiotics? Are your products addressing all of that? And what are some ways, yeah, again, parents can become more aware of that?
I'm so glad you asked because the gut microbiome is just such a powerful of ours, we call it the little command center of the growing body, and we need to do more to support it. And there's so many things, every single thing in our life essentially is attacking it now. The bugs are dying inside of us at astronomical levels. In fact, a new study had come out in 2020 that 9 out of 10 babies weren't even being born with the positive gut microbiome bacteria that we need. And this is actually a massive threat to humanity because we co-evolved with these bugs for a long time and we need them to live. And so we need to find ways to support them in more ways. So a couple of the just different ways is that it's like, where do we start, right? Spending more time outside. There's this whole theory of clean theory where everything's way too clean. Everything is antibacterial wipes. I see these on the airplanes. Honestly, I'm like, that's actually it in my opinion, it's worse than just you need exposure to these bacteria and viruses, right? To build up our immune system. If we're too fragile, that's a problem. Eliminating all of those, cutting down on antibiotics when you can. I hear stories, kiddos are going to the doctor 12 times, 12 rounds of antibiotics in 1 year. Really? Did you really need that every single time? Was it just like maybe a virus? But the over prescription of antibiotics is something to watch out for. Of course, antibiotics are life-saving, and it's not that there is no role for them, but are they overprescribed? Uh, of course, number one with our food and nutrition is removing overprocessed foods, right? How can you eliminate the things that do have 10,000 things on the label? Other ones are extending the breastfeeding years if you can. I'm a really big fan of getting our probiotics. I'm glad you brought that up. Probiotics versus prebiotics for everyone asking. Probiotics are the living bacteria that live within us. The prebiotics are not alive. They are the food for the probiotics. And they feed and support and proliferate the probiotic. Probiotics is a touchy subject. There's more. I'm actually of the opinion that we need to study it more. I'm not even sure that I personally don't even consume a probiotic. The way that I can get my probiotics, I always say we need to get it from food. Number one way I loved getting it is through kefir and other fermented foods. That's a lot harder for kids, of course, but kefir is a little bit easier. Smoothies for kids, but you really want to get your live bacteria from food. And historically, that's always look at cuisines across the world, right? Kimchi in Korea, you have the sauerkraut from Germany.
Yeah.
All of these ways of getting these fermented foods historically really are absent in our standard American diet. So how can you incorporate a probiotic from your food source? I love to say in every meal, just even a little bit,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, there's so many different ways to support your gut and try to eliminate the things that are bad. Even now, one of the other things is like scents and fragrances and cleaning products. Like everything needs to be audited because honestly, like there's a cleaner, more organic way of approaching it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate that too, because to your point, there you can get it through foods, but often it's knowing what foods to consume and whether or not certain things are giving you the nutritional value that you need. So the fermented foods, I agree, but to your point, how many people are aware of that and how many are incorporating it into their diet? So it's really important to, again, go do your due diligence and educate yourself and understand what you need to stay healthy. And unfortunately, this is something I brought up, but I was talking to someone recently about the cost of organic foods can be deterrent for people. But this point this person made was, but the value you're getting per dollar spent in the grand scheme of things is still worth it, right? So on the surface, it may seem like you're spending a lot of money, but you're getting a lot of intangibles. And one of the things before we started this episode, I was sharing my personal experiences. We also underestimate how being healthy can pay dividends in different ways, right? Like the amount of energy and focus I have by making small changes in my dietary choices has allowed me to be more productive. So that can pay off in different ways. I'm not having to waste time going to see doctors. I'm not feeling lethargic and missing out on opportunities that I can be taking advantage of. So there's all these other things we have to keep at the forefront too that we often don't think about, right? So just throwing that out there, but curious to hear your thoughts around some of that stuff as well.
Yeah, it goes back to I am so passionate about health in America. Health is our first freedom. And if we are sick and dependent on a system, we are not free. And that was ever more evident in COVID, right? When all of a sudden we rely on medications coming from overseas and you no longer have access to them. And it's, wait, that's the drug that's keeping me alive. We need to invest in our health because it is what keeps us strong. It's what keeps us our mind clear, and it keeps us engaged as citizens. And if you are weak and dependent on a drug or a system, that is a problem. So I am so passionate about this. And how can we create lifelong health through better choices? And so for me, absolutely, like my health insurance plan is my food bill, essentially, because it is expensive. And I think we do need to normalize that healthy food is an investment. Of course, Americans love trading convenience for maybe longer term preventative measures, of course. So yes, it is easier to stop by and get the processed version of X because it takes longer to make at home. It is more expensive, but actually in the long run, it's actually cheaper because I don't have these big health bills, right? The culture does need to change a little bit when it comes to food. And ultimately, yes, I think the bigger issue, not only with the cost of rising food costs from the organic stuff, all across the board, food's rising, right? But it is the time commitment. And a lot of times people talk about time poverty, where they don't have the time to make the food in this. And that is a problem. And I understand and I can empathize with that. But you're right. Like those are to me are investments. And you need to make those investments for your family, for yourselves. Like that is the personal responsibility. It's like we do need to prioritize what matters. And ultimately, health, in my opinion, is one of the top priorities that we should have for ourselves. We should demand it from ourselves. It is our personal responsibility and is the responsibility for our families.
Yes, I completely agree. And then coming back to then having that focus for our children too, right? And we touched on it at the beginning, is we often take it for granted. And while we are all resilient, and to your point, the human body is very resilient, that we can fight a lot of these infections, or our immune system needs to go through some of these rebuilding processes. But there's also we also need to have that focus that if we're not investing early on in the child's life, in their health, and making sure they're consuming nutritional food, because there's so much access to processed sugars and fats and all kinds of stuff out there that can have consequences later on in their life. So how do we then bring that to the forefront again? And I know you've touched on it in different ways, but what is your message to parents or caretakers when it comes to investing that time and energy in the child's nutrition early in life, rather than taking it for granted? And I'm not saying it with judgment that they take it for granted because they're being lazy or careless. It's just something that's not always a focus, right? So how do we invest that time and energy into understanding some of these things?
Yeah, I think number one is that we have to be role models. And in order to be a role model, you have to do the hard thing yourself. I'm not a parent yet, and who am I to be telling everyone be healthier? But we do need to live and breathe this approach to health so that the kids can really see that is the way to live. If your kid is seeing that you're overweight, sloppy with your food, dependent on some drug, like it starts to normalize it. And we actually need to stop normalizing as a society that being unhealthy is okay. Actually, it's not okay to be overweight. We know that if you're overweight, you are a lot more likely to experience other health issues. And so we can't normalize that. It's not okay. And as a society, we need to be harsher about that and be more, just serious that we need to be healthy. And it starts, and being honest, that it does start with nutrition and physical activity. Like we know these things. Of course, there's always going to be outliers, right? Where people do have conditions and whatnot. But by and large, it is incumbent on our own personal responsibility to our health and to be role models to our kids. Unfortunately, once your kiddos starts going down the wrong path, they are overweight, they are used to processed foods and relying on them, they are going to take those habits into adulthood. And we know also that we all want the best for our kids, and we want them to be healthy. We want them to be of a sound mind. If we know that nutrition is what's powering all of this, we should really be prioritizing that, right? So if your kid may be overweight, it's like, all right, let's start those interventions as early as possible. How can we get them outside more? How can we change their diet? It is our responsibility to do that. And then also there's this whole rise in all these medications for kids, right? Now they're saying some like astronomical number of like how many, I don't even know if it's 6 in 10 or 9 in 10 kids have ADHD, or that might be over exaggerating, but it's like some big number, right? And my response to that is the kids don't have ADHD. They just need to eat better. You do not need to put them on a drug to help them focus more. And then this all ties over into then educational achievement. If your kiddo is constipated, bloated, uncomfortable, how do you expect them to sit in a classroom and then learn? And then now you're telling me that they're underachieving at school? Yeah, of course they are. This is all really all interconnected, and it all really starts with what we consume. And that message could not be more clear that we do need to focus and invest and prioritize that.
Yeah. And to your point around role modeling, this is something I've repeated many times, is that children are not necessarily listening to what we're saying. They're watching us to kind of decide how they're going to show up and behave. So if we're saying something and doing the opposite, we're confusing them, and we're not really being good role models from that perspective. So I agree with you on that. And even with the classroom stuff, there's many issues. Definitely diet's one of them. I've talked to experts on even screens and the amount of
Oh man, don't even get me started on screens.
like just how much time they're spending on screens. So it's no wonder why they're struggling in classrooms and not able to pay attention, because that's very uncomfortable for them. And to your point, if they're not feeling comfortable with their body, that's probably adding to it as well. So there's a whole multitude of issues that children are facing, and us as adults have a huge role to play, and we can't just expect someone else to take care of it for us. The teachers are also burdened, and they've got 30, 40 kids that they have to take care of, right? So we can do more at home with our children. So I definitely appreciate all that. I do have one more question for you around just your entrepreneurial spirit and kind of growing up in a small town. Do you feel like that work ethic that you were perhaps surrounded by has impacted you and influenced you in your ability to stick with the goals that you have for yourself? I'm always curious to understand where people get their entrepreneurial drive from. So just wanted to understand
Oh,
yours.
that's a great question, and I have to think about it. But when you come from a small town and you don't come from a lot, it's like you have nothing left to lose. You just go for it, right? And so sometimes actually I think that entrepreneurs that don't come from these really like big backgrounds actually are make better entrepreneurs because they're less risk averse, and they're just like ready to just dive in. And they have that resiliency, that grit, and that because you had to figure it out to start with, right? You only have yourself to really fall back on. And really always appreciate really where I came from, because it really did instill those values of hard work, responsibility, and that if I was ever going to leave that town, it was going to be up to me. And so I really do appreciate that. And not only to mention, it's just problems that are worth working on. That's what really motivated me always. Just like hard stuff. There's easier ways to make money, believe me. But it's not about that, right? It's about like really leaving our mark on this world and using our God-given gifts to really focus on those things, right? And a lot of times when it comes to risk taking and stuff like that, I always think that the bigger risk was like staying down a route where you are in that 9 to 5 type of role. And like, to me, that's a bigger risk because then you're, dependent on a system, right? And so I don't know. I really appreciate entrepreneurship, and just working on hard things. I love talking to other entrepreneurs that are thinking about big ideas and collaborating on it because it's an exciting time to build, and I couldn't recommend it more.
Yeah, yeah. And what I'm hearing from you is there's a meaningful experience in that sacrifice, right? In that grind. Whereas maybe if you're kind of finding the safest way to make money, you're probably not feeling that sense of fulfillment as easy as it can be. So I definitely appreciate that piece as well. Now, for listeners that want to understand more about you and the work and Begin Health, what are some ways they can do that? Whether it's going online, whether it's maybe getting a hold of you, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah, please. We're at beginhealth.com. We're on Instagram. We are now on TikTok. So come find us there. But my email is Madeline@beginhealth.com. So always excited to chat with people about their own gut health journeys, entrepreneurship, anything. So I'm here for it. But yeah, come check us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline, for the work you're doing and coming on here and sharing your experience and also trying to educate parents because there's a lot of information out there. And I hope parents are able to find some valuable insights from this episode as well, but in general. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Take care.